The Honourable Steve Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm going to take a quick call on Part 3, and it probably reflects the fact that some of us weren't on the Select Committee, but we were trying to get our heads around this new EPA, and as opposed to the old EPA, and I suppose Part 3 shows us what's in and what's out, and the danger of this is the missing bits, and I can't work out for the life of me if this is an authority to protect and enhance the environment, which we really did hope it was, Minister, in the Chair. There are some substantial bits missing, and one of the issues that I'm really worried about here is the disestablishment of URMA and the Ngā Kahotu Tikanga Tauā. Now, I understand the Māori Party have got acceptance of a treaty clause to go into this bill, but I can't understand why we're setting up a Māori advisory committee to the EPA, so it's subservient to the EPA. And just an advisory committee. We've had trouble with Māori advisory committees and their standing in terms of how much their advice is taken by any authority. We saw it in Auckland City, we saw it in Canterbury, we're now seeing it again in this new EPA. You don't just tuck government, it's too tidy to think, well, just tuck a Treaty of Waitangi clause in, and therefore we look after the interests of Māori and iwi. And to the Minister and the Chair, I'm glad he is there. I'm not sure whether the iwi Advisory Committee is going to pick up the functions of Ngā Kahotu Tikanga Tauā, or is it an entirely new apparatus that you are intending for this committee and this little advisory committee? How toothless is it? How much authority has it? Is it going to be listened to, or is it just a little bit of flannel sitting there in the EPA that's listened to but not taken much notice of? And that's something that I think is offensive to Māori. And one of the issues that concerns me greatly is what is missing in this bill. And that's what I'm struggling to find out. Why aren't these bits here? With this movement of all of these has no responsibilities and URMA and what's in and what's out and what's now sitting with the Ministry for the Environment, it isn't easy to understand, and heaven knows I was a Minister of Conservation for some time, so I do understand the overlapping responsibilities between conservation and protection of the estate and species and environment, and this doesn't make it any clearer to me at all. It's amazing that coastal marine management and environmental management of New Zealand's economic zone isn't part of this EPA. I can't work that out. We did have a Minister of Conservation, though, that sat on the coastal policy statement for over 18 months. It was ready to go when I had completed my term in office and wasn't tabled in the House until pressure was put on this government.
Mr Chairman, we're debating Part 3 of this bill. There's absolutely no reference of national policy statements or any, frankly, of the other matters that the member's been raising. This part is limited to the disestablishment. We've already argued about the functions of the new EPA. This section is simply about the disestablishment and the transfer of functions. The issue of the Maori Committee was covered in the previous part, and I think the member should have to be brought back to the provisions of this part.
Yeah, I'd ask the member to debate Part 3.
Thank you for the Minister's clarification, but I think the point is made about what is missing, and I'll continue to try and get my head around this. What we're not sure about is the disestablishment of URMA. And I can remember a predecessor of mine, Jeanette Fitzsimons, who actually battled away to get URMA better resourced, and in the disestablishment of URMA in subpart 2 of Part 3, I hope the Minister's pleased I'm referring to that in this Part 3 debate, I am really concerned that are all the functions of URMA going to carry over into this new authority? We're really not sure just what's in and what's out, and I think that's going to raise confusion before us all, even though the Minister is very clear in his head, apparently. Minister, it's about how we tell the story to New Zealanders so they have confidence in this EPA. And at the moment, because there's so many shifts here with staff from the Ministry of Environment and staff from the Ministry of Economic Development to the EPA, the functions of the former EPA under the Climate Change Response Act that are now going to be in as part of the EPA, I think the country is confused, and when we're confused, the Minister must accept that we don't have confidence that this new authority is going to have any more teeth, any more powers of coercion and any more effectiveness.
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman, and I probably have to apologise to my colleagues for a start, because I'll say something nice about the legislation, and the Minister may fall over as well. I think it's great that in the transfer of staff here to the EPA, that their terms and conditions are locked in and carried over. And I have to say that I'm almost amazed and shocked that the national government would do anything like this, but it is a very good precedent to set, Mr Chairman. And the question I have of the Minister, I guess, is this going to be the new standard for changes in the public sector? Because we accept that the government seems to be focused on efficiency, restructuring, part privatisation, call it what you like. And what we see in this part here are some very good provisions, I have to say. And that if I can quote, this section applies for the purpose of the Act. The employee's employment is to be treated as unbroken, and the employee's period of service with the previous employer ending on the close of day before the employee is transferred. In summary, Mr Speaker, and I accept criticism that I wasn't on the Select Committee, so I may not get it entirely right, but I think any New Zealander, as my colleague, the previous speaker, said, reading through the bill will have these questions. And it's very reasonable that we in opposition ask them here, not as members of the committee who have heard hours and hours of submissions, but as people who pick this piece of legislation up, read it and say, what does this mean? Because what you can be sure is that lawyers around the country will pick it up and take two meanings from the one word. That's indeed the job of lawyers, in fact. But the public, well, yes, with all due respect to my colleague in the front there, of course, for good reason usually. But the point being, Mr Speaker, is that this does allow transfer of unbroken employment terms and conditions, and that is to be welcome. The only question I have, Mr Speaker, and relates to subpart 3, is who and how many will be transferred over, because it is a little silent in that area. So I guess it leaves open the way for reduction in staff, although I'm led to believe that the EPA is severely understaffed at the present. And so any changes or cutbacks would just undermine the credibility, not just the integrity, but the credibility of the EPA. Mr Chairman, I go on to another part. Well, it's in part 3 of the bill. And this is the consequences of transfer of climate change functions. And I have to applaud the legislation, because what it infers is that the functions of the former agency, under the Climate Change Response Act, and that's IRMA, I'm assuming, must be carried on. And if I can quote, the commencement, continuation or enforcement of proceedings relating to the function by or against a former agency may instead be carried out by or against the EPA without amendment to the proceedings. It goes on then to say that a matter or thing relating to the function that would, but for this section, have been completed by a former agency may be completed by the EPA. Now, Mr Chairman, I know you think it's a bit like watching grass grow, hearing this, but the devil is in the detail. And we too often pass legislation in this House that hasn't been thoroughly assessed. The Select Committee may have been pressured. I understand the Minister's under a bit of pressure at the moment, and he might push through something that, in fact, may be detrimental. the questions I have in the commitment to the climate change obligations, which I applaud, Mr. Speaker, I think that infers that environmental standards in this area will be upheld by the new Environmental Protection Agency. So if we could take, for example, the transmission gully proposal, where I guess the emissions assessments relating to that project, and there are extensive reports done in this area before any such project goes through government agencies now, that the emissions part of that will be upheld by the new agency. But the water and air quality standards may very well lapse. Mr. Chairman.
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you. I'll just take a brief call. It is a genuine question, and where there are big projects that the Environmental Protection Agency has intervened on, and we may think for good reason, for efficiency, whatever the national government thinks, the questions of whether, through this Part 3, the upholding of the climate change response obligations, which I applaud, will surpass those of other environmental standards around water quality, around air quality, and any runoff. And I put to you, Mr. Chairman, and the Minister may want to take a call, why are we putting emissions, which we understand are very important, right up there on a pedestal and allowing through the Act those to be carried through into the new agency, but we're saying when it comes to water quality, and my colleague referred to the issues around dairying, and no doubt the projects that will be brought to the EPA around agriculture. So we uphold the emissions obligations, but we forget about the water quality. I don't think New Zealanders will accept that as being fair, and they won't accept that this is progress in the area of environmental management, Mr. Chairman. So I thank you for the ability to finish on that issue.
Are you seeking a call?
Yes.
Joe Goodhue.
I move that the question be now put.
Stuart Williams.